That bitch! I knew she was hiding money! That's my house! She owes me that house!
No, we stay on the record. Mr. Montgomery, you submitted Plaintiff's Exhibit A to the court. Are you withdrawing it, or are you doubling down on a felony?
I was 32 years old, sitting in the polished leather chair of a title office in downtown Austin, Texas. The air conditioning was humming against the brutal August heat, and the ink was still wet on a stack of closing documents 3 inches thick. I had just signed my name to a 50-acre ranch in the Texas Hill Country. It was a private sanctuary surrounded by ancient live oaks, limestone bluffs, and a heavy wrought iron gate. And then, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from my mother. "So proud of you, sweetie. Dad and I are packing up Chloe and the kids right now. They should be at the new property by 6 p.m. Leave the gate unlocked. We told her she could take the main farmhouse, since she really needs the space for the kids, and you can stay in the guest cabin. Family takes care of family. See you soon." I didn't scream. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't even blink. A decade ago, a text like that would have sent me into a hyperventilating panic attack. But the woman sitting in that title office had stopped being their victim a very long time ago. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 2:14 p.m. Instead of replying to my mother, I took a screenshot, forwarded it to my attorney, and typed a single, calculated sentence. They took the bait. Execute the order. By 5:15 p.m., my parents and my sister would not be pulling their overloaded U-Haul trucks onto my immaculate gravel driveway. Instead, they would be standing on their own front porch in the Austin suburbs, staring down the barrel of a Travis County sheriff. They would be holding 5-year protective orders, listening to a district judge screaming at them through a speakerphone, realizing that the quiet, compliant daughter they had, bled dry for a lifetime, had just locked them out of her universe forever. If you have ever been the scapegoat of a family that treats your bank account like public infrastructure and your boundaries like a personal insult, pull up a chair. This story is for you. To understand how we got to a sheriff, a screaming judge, and a 50-acre fortress, you have to understand the sick arithmetic of my family. In my house, love was a currency, and it was entirely monopolized by my older sister, Chloe. To call Chloe a train wreck would be an insult to the predictability of trains. She was a diagnosed narcissist with severe bipolar traits and a sociopathic streak that allowed her to sleep peacefully after ruining someone else's life. By the time she was 30, she had produced 5 children by 4 different men. I don't call them children, though. I call them the 5 demons. They were feral, undisciplined, and completely unaccountable, tearing through the world and our family's peace like a localized hurricane. Braden, Caden, Jaden, Aiden, and Zayden broke things, stole things, and demanded the world bow to them, exactly like their mother. And my parents, Margaret and Richard, were her dedicated enablers, the cleanup crew that followed the hurricane with a checkbook and a mop. Nobody ever sat me down and explained the rules, but I learned them the way you learn a stove is hot. Money and empathy in our house went to whoever was drowning, and Chloe was always drowning. I, on the other hand, was the one who learned to swim. I worked night shifts as a pediatric trauma nurse, clipped coupons, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with mismatched hubcaps, and raised my son Leo entirely on my own. The true betrayal, the one that started the timer on this ticking time bomb, happened when Leo was 12 years old. My grandfather, a shrewd, hard-working man who saw right through my parents' enabling and Chloe's manipulation, passed away. In his will, he explicitly bypassed my parents and left a $350,000 trust fund for Leo. It was meant for his college tuition, a down payment on a house, a head start in a world that is merciless to young men. But Granddad made one fatal error. Because Leo was a minor, he named my father, Richard, as the financial trustee of the UTMA account until Leo turned 18. For 3 years, I slept soundly knowing my son's future was secure. I was working 60-hour weeks at the hospital, assuming the trust was sitting in a Vanguard account gathering compound interest. I found out the truth on a Tuesday in November. I had asked my dad for a routine financial statement for Leo's FAFSA applications as we were looking ahead to early college credits. My dad deflected. He hemmed and hawed, talking about market fluctuations and tied-up assets. I didn't argue. I just hired a forensic accountant. What the accountant found made the blood drain out of my head. The account wasn't fluctuating. It was completely empty, a zero balance. Over the course of 36 months, my father had systematically drained my son's future to fund Chloe's present. There were emergency loans to the trust that were actually cashier's checks cut directly to Chloe's criminal defense attorneys when she was arrested for credit card fraud. There were withdrawals labeled educational expenses that paid for a luxury rehab center in Malibu, a rehab Chloe walked out of after 4 days. They had literally stolen my son's trust fund to keep my sister out of federal prison and in Louis Vuitton handbags. When I confronted them in their kitchen, dropping the bank statements on the granite island they had probably paid for with Leo's money, there was no apology. My mother folded her hands, looked me dead in the eye, and delivered a line I will remember until the day I die. Money is just paper, Sarah. Your sister was in crisis. Leo is a smart boy. He can take out student loans like everyone else. You've always been so capable, honey. You'll figure it out. I didn't yell. Yelling implies you want to be heard, that you believe the other party possesses a conscience to appeal to. I realized in that exact moment that you cannot reason with a tumor. You can only surgically remove it. I filed a civil lawsuit against my father for breach of fiduciary duty. But this is where the American legal system fails you. The money was gone, spent, evaporated into attorney's fees and Chloe's bottomless pit of debt. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, and my parents had mortgaged their own home to the hilt just to keep up appearances. Even if I won a judgment, I would be collecting pennies for the next 40 years. But they didn't just steal the money. They realized that if I was willing to sue them, I was a threat. So they retaliated in the most vicious, unforgivable way imaginable. They came for my relationship with my son. Because I was working endless hospital shifts to rebuild the money they had stolen, Leo was spending afternoons at their house after school. I didn't know it, but they were dripping poison into his ear, day by day. They told him the lawsuit was my fault. They told him I was greedy, that I was trying to leave his grandmother homeless. Chloe, the master manipulator, would sit on the porch crying crocodile tears, telling a 14-year-old boy that his mother was trying to tear the family apart out of pure jealousy. Parental alienation is a quiet kind of murder. It doesn't leave bruises. It just rearranges the wiring in a child's brain until they look at you like you're a monster. By the time Leo was 16, he wouldn't speak to me. He moved into my parents' spare bedroom. I fought them in family court, but a 16-year-old in Texas has a lot of say in where he wants to live. I lost him. They stole his money, and when I fought back, they stole my child. That was the year I went completely, absolutely silent. I dropped the lawsuit. I stopped calling. I stopped showing up for Thanksgiving dinners. I became a ghost in my own family. My mother mistook my silence for surrender. She thought I had finally accepted my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. She had no idea that beneath the surface, I was building an empire made of spite and compound interest. Over the next 5 years, I funneled every ounce of my grief into my work. I started a specialized healthcare staffing agency. I knew the hospital system inside and out, and I knew how to place high-value travel nurses across the country. I worked 20-hour days. I built a network. My income didn't just double, it multiplied by 10. I lived in a tiny, cheap apartment above a laundromat. I drove the same old Honda. I let my family believe I was struggling, barely scraping by. Whenever my mother called to brag about Chloe's new financed SUV, or to casually mention that Leo was doing well but just needed space, I would agree in a meek, defeated voice. Yes, Mom, I'm just focusing on paying rent. I hope you guys are well. I gave them exactly what they wanted, the illusion of superiority. Meanwhile, I was quietly buying up real estate. And then, I found it. The 50-acre ranch, a sprawling, beautiful estate with a primary farmhouse, a guest cabin, and a massive barn, sold at a foreclosure auction. I bought it entirely in cash through a blind LLC so my name wouldn't appear on the public county records. Nobody on earth knew I owned it. But to set the trap that would eventually result in a screaming judge and a lifetime ban, I needed a catalyst. I needed a reason so irrefutable, so legally binding, that no court in the state would ever let them near me again. Chloe and my parents provided that reason all on their own. They provided the attempted murders. Yes, murders. Plural. It happened 6 months before I closed on the ranch. By this time, Leo was 19. The poison they had fed him had started to sour. He was beginning to see the stark reality of living with Chloe and her 5 demons. The chaos, the screaming matches, the police showing up at 2 a.m. because Chloe was throwing plates at her latest boyfriend. Leo was realizing that his mother hadn't been the villain. She had been the shield. One rainy evening, Leo called me. It was the first time I had heard his voice in 3 years. He sounded terrified. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling over the Bluetooth connection. "Chloe is driving. She's out of her mind. I think she took something. The kids are in the back, and she won't pull over." My blood turned to ice. "Where are you, Leo? Drop a pin on your location right now." "I'm calling 911. Before he could answer, I heard Chloe screeching in the background. "Who are you talking to? Give me the damn phone." There was a violent scuffle, the sickening sound of tearing metal, shattered glass, and then dead silence. I didn't call my parents. I called the Texas Highway Patrol. I gave them the live location from Leo's phone tracker, located somewhere on Interstate 35. When I arrived at the scene, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the wet asphalt, the reality of my family's depravity hit me with the force of a freight train. Chloe had rear-ended a flatbed semi-truck at 70 miles an hour, but she wasn't in the driver's seat. She wasn't even at the scene. When the car crashed, Chloe, high on a cocktail of stolen prescription pills, panicked. She knew she was facing a felony DUI, reckless driving, and severe child endangerment charges, so she dragged her concussed, bleeding 19-year-old nephew, my son, into the driver's seat, pulled her 5 screaming children out of the wrecked vehicle, called my parents, and fled the scene into the night. My parents drove to the highway, picked up Chloe and her kids, and left my son unconscious, bleeding from a severe head wound, trapped in the driver's seat of a smoking vehicle. They left him to take the fall for a felony. They left him to potentially die, just to protect their precious golden child. That was attempted murder number 1. Attempted murder number 2 happened exactly 4 days later in the hospital. Leo was in the intensive care unit with a severe traumatic brain injury. I had not left his bedside for 96 hours. I had emergency medical power of attorney reinstated the moment the state troopers pulled the dashcam footage from the semi-truck, proving Chloe was the one driving. My parents were legally banned from the hospital floor. But my mother, who believed the rules of the universe did not apply to her, snuck in through the service elevator wearing a stolen volunteer badge. She didn't come to comfort her grandson. She came to silence him. I walked out of the restroom just in time to see my mother standing over Leo's bed, aggressively shaking him awake, trying to force a pen into his hand to sign a typed statement absolving Chloe of all responsibility. When his heart rate monitor started blaring in distress, my mother panicked. To stop the nurses from rushing in, she reached over and ripped the central IV line straight out of his arm, causing him to hemorrhage blood over the pristine white sheets. She nearly killed a boy in intensive care just to protect a sociopath from a prison sentence. I didn't just call hospital security. I called the police. My mother was dragged out of the ICU in handcuffs, screaming that I was tearing the family apart. It was the brutal wake-up call Leo needed. The fog of parental alienation shattered completely. He realized they had stolen his money, used him as a scapegoat, and literally left him for dead. As he recovered over the next few months, we spent hours talking, crying, and putting the broken pieces of our relationship back together. I moved him into my apartment, hired private security, and began the quiet, methodical process of utterly destroying my family's access to our lives. I pressed maximum charges, But Chloe, slippery as ever, plea bargained her way into a court-ordered luxury inpatient facility. My mother got off with probation for the hospital incident because it was classified as a family dispute by a lenient local judge. They thought it was over. They thought they had survived the storm. They thought the status quo would eventually return. What they didn't know was that I had gathered every police report, every medical record, the dash cam footage, the ICU security tapes, and the testimonies. I had a legal binder 3 inches thick, and I was quietly waiting for the perfect moment to drop the hammer. That moment was closing day for the ranch. My family, completely oblivious to my actual financial status, assumed I was still a struggling nurse in a tiny apartment. So when a mutual aunt let it slip on the family group chat that I was buying a house, my parents' radar immediately pinged. They assumed I had managed to scrape together an FHA loan for some modest 3-bedroom suburban house. And in their parasitic minds, a new house meant new real estate for them to colonize. Chloe had just been kicked out of her rental because her 5 demons had literally torn the drywall down to the studs. She needed a place to live. And to my parents, my property was family property. Which brings us back to the leather chair, the wet ink, and the text message at 2:14 p.m. So proud of you, sweetie. Dad and I are packing up Chloe and the kids right now. We told her she could take the main farmhouse. They were already on their way. They had packed their U-Hauls, fully intending to ambush me on moving day, barge through the doors, and establish residency. In Texas, once someone moves their belongings in and stays a few nights, evicting them takes months of legal hell. They knew the law. They were trying to squat in my home on day 1. I typed the message to my attorney. They took the bait. Execute the order. For the past month, my lawyer and I had been quietly appearing before a different, much less lenient district judge. We presented the binder. The stolen trust fund, financial abuse. The highway hit and run, felony endangerment. The ICU assault, tampering with a witness and battery. The judge was absolutely horrified. He granted an absolute ironclad 5-year ex parte restraining order against my mother, my father, and my sister. It covered me, my son, and any property I owned. The orders were signed, sealed, and sitting in a folder at the county sheriff's office, waiting for my signal. I had given the sheriff's department the exact address of my parents' house and warned them that my family was currently packing moving trucks to cross county lines. At 3 p.m., I drove out to my new 50-acre fortress. I parked my car, walked onto the wraparound porch of the farmhouse, poured a glass of iced tea, and waited. At exactly 5:10 p.m., my phone started ringing. It was my mother. I ignored it. Then my father. Ignored. Then the family group chat, the flying monkeys, started exploding. My phone was vibrating so hard it was slowly spinning on the cedar patio table. I sat back in my Adirondack chair, taking a slow sip of sweet tea. The Texas sun was starting to dip below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across my 50 acres. The cicadas were humming. It was the most peaceful afternoon of my entire life. I finally picked up the phone. The family group chat, creatively named Holloway Clan, was a war zone. There were 42 unread messages in the span of 6 minutes. The flying monkeys had been activated. Aunt Cheryl was typing in all caps. Sarah Marie Holloway, your mother is in tears. What is going on? My cousin Mark, who still lived in his mother's basement and considered himself the alpha male of the family, chimed in. You need to answer your phone right now. I'm driving over to your apartment to talk some sense into you. You don't treat family like this. Uncle Bob. Sarah, there are police cars at your parents' house. Call us immediately. Chloe is hyperventilating on the lawn. I didn't type a response. Not yet. I opened my camera app, stood up, and took a slow panoramic video of my sprawling ranch. I captured the massive, centuries-old oak trees, the limestone barn, the rolling hills, and finally, I zoomed in on the heavy wrought iron gate at the entrance, securely locked with a heavy-duty padlock. I sent the video to the chat. Then, I opened my Files app and uploaded the PDFs my attorney had just sent over. Document 1, the 5-year restraining order against Richard Holloway. Document 2, the 5-year restraining order against Margaret Holloway. Document 3, the 5-year restraining order against Chloe Holloway. And finally, I typed a single, meticulously crafted text message to the entire extended family. My parents stole my son's $350,000 trust fund, destroyed my relationship with him, left him for dead in a felony hit and run, and then had the audacity to try and move my narcissistic sociopath sister and her 5 demons into my new ranch the day I closed. They are currently being served with 5-year protective orders by the Travis County Sheriff. The judge is on speakerphone with them right now. Y'all are more than welcome to allow the attempted murderers and moochers into your homes, but they will never step foot on my land. If any of you contact me on their behalf or show up at my gate, I will file harassment charges and trespassing warrants against you as well. Have a blessed evening. I hit send. The chat went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop in cyberspace. Meanwhile, 30 miles away in the manicured suburbs of Austin, the scene was playing out exactly as I had orchestrated it. I found out the delicious details later through the official police report, the body cam footage I subpoenaed for my own records, and a very panicked, drunken voicemail my father left on a burner phone months later. When the 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled up to their driveway, lights flashing but sirens off, my parents and Chloe were hauling a battered floral sofa into the back of a rented U-Haul truck. Chloe's 5 kids were screaming, fighting, and running around the front lawn, actively trampling my mother's prize-winning petunias. Deputy Miller, a tall, imposing man who had 0 patience for suburban drama, stepped out of his cruiser, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. Richard and Margaret Holloway? Chloe Holloway? My mother, ever the neighborhood diplomat, wiped her hands on her designer jeans and put on her best, most condescending PTA mom smile. Yes, officer? Can we help you? There's no emergency here. We're just packing up to move my daughter into her new house. Ma'am, step away from the vehicle, Deputy Miller instructed, his voice flat and authoritative. I have 3 protective orders issued by Judge Harmon of the 126th District Court. You are hereby ordered to cease all contact, physical, electronic, or through third parties, with Sarah Holloway and Leo Holloway. You are barred from coming within 1,000 feet of their persons, their places of employment, and their primary residence located in Blanco County. My mother's fake smile slipped off her face like wet clay. Her brain simply couldn't process the words. Excuse me? There must be a mistake. We are going to my daughter's house. She just bought it. Family takes care of family. Sarah is just throwing a little tantrum. She doesn't mean this. Chloe, who possessed the survival instincts of a cornered rat, immediately started screaming. That bitch? I knew she was hiding money. That's my house. She owes me that house. She dropped the sofa cushion she was holding and lunged toward the deputy, demanding to see the paperwork. That was her first fatal mistake. You do not lunge at Texas law enforcement. Deputy Miller immediately stepped back and unclipped his taser. Ma'am, step back right now or you will be detained. My father, trying to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation and avoid having his favorite daughter tased on the front lawn, threw his hands up. Officer, please, this is a misunderstanding. It's a family dispute. My daughter is just being dramatic because of an old argument. Let me just call her and clear this up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Sir, the second deputy warned, stepping forward and shining a flashlight directly into my father's eyes despite it being daylight. If you dial that number, you will be violating a court order in my physical presence, and I will arrest you on the spot and impound that moving truck. It was in that exact moment that the reality of the situation finally breached the reinforced concrete of my parents' delusion. They weren't in control anymore. The quiet, compliant scapegoat hadn't just bitten back. She had summoned the full, crushing weight of the judicial system. But my mother, afflicted with a terminal case of entitlement, couldn't let it go. She demanded to speak to a superior. She shrieked that the orders were fraudulent, built on lies, and that I had somehow bribed a judge. So, the deputy obliged. He went back to his cruiser, pulled out his radio, and connected directly to the judge's clerk. Because of the history of violence and the ICU incident, Judge Harmon was on standby. The deputy put the radio on speaker, holding it up in the driveway for the entire neighborhood to hear. Judge Harmon was a no-nonsense, old-school Texas jurist. He had spent 3 hours the previous afternoon reviewing the financial forensics, the highway patrol dashcam footage of my son bleeding out, and the hospital security tapes. He was not in a forgiving mood. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, the judge's voice boomed over the radio, echoing off the vinyl siding of their house. The neighbors, who had stepped out onto their porches pretending to water their lawns, were now listening in absolute horror. "I signed those orders myself," the judge continued, his voice dripping with venom. "I reviewed the financial records of the UTMA account you drained. I reviewed the dashcam footage of your daughter abandoning an injured teenager in a wrecked vehicle. And I reviewed the hospital security footage of Mrs. Holloway physically assaulting a patient in critical care." My parents froze. The color drained from my father's face. "You will not go near Sarah Holloway. You will not go near Leo Holloway. You will not drive to Blanco County. If you violate this order, if you send a text, if you send a carrier pigeon, I will issue a bench warrant for your arrest, and I will personally see to it that you spend the maximum allowable time in the county jail. Do you understand me?" My father, trembling, managed to whisper, "Yes, Your Honor." Chloe, however, was completely incapable of shame. The only thing she cared about was her own convenience. "What about me and my kids?" she shrieked at the radio. "Where are we supposed to live? We're packed. I gave up my lease." The judge's voice dropped to a low, lethal register. "That sounds like a personal problem, Ms. Holloway. I suggest you unpack." The radio clicked off. They were left standing in their driveway, surrounded by half-packed boxes, 5 screaming children, and the glaring, judgmental eyes of every neighbor they had ever tried to impress with their country club memberships and fake perfect lives. The U-Haul they had rented for the weekend was utterly useless. The grand plan to colonize my sanctuary was dead on arrival. Back at the ranch, I watched the read receipts on the family group chat. Every single aunt, uncle, and cousin had read the message. They had opened the PDFs. Aunt Cheryl, the family's biggest gossip and my mother's primary enabler, sent exactly one direct message to me before I blocked her number out of principle. "Sarah, I had no idea about the trust fund or the accident. My God, your mother told us Leo was just going through a rebellious phase and doing drugs. I am so sorry." They shut up super fast when they realized I wasn't playing around. The narrative my mother had spun for 32 years, the narrative that Chloe was a misunderstood victim of the world and I was the cold, ungrateful, selfish daughter, evaporated in the span of a single afternoon. But here is the thing about a narcissistic family structure. It is a parasitic organism. When the primary host finally cuts them off and locks the door, the parasites don't just go away, they turn on each other. With me safely locked behind 50 acres of iron and limestone, and Leo recovering and working alongside me in my healthcare staffing business, my parents and Chloe were suddenly trapped in a pressure cooker of their own making. Chloe had nowhere to go, no money, and no lease. So inevitably, she and the 5 demons moved back into my parents' pristine 4-bedroom suburban house. It took exactly 3 weeks for the police to be called to that address again. It took exactly 3 weeks for the police to be called to that address again. To understand the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe my parents had invited into their home, you have to understand the specific ecosystem of an upscale Texas suburban homeowners association. My mother, Margaret, was a woman who defined her entire existence by her social standing. She was the former president of the HOA. She hosted the annual cul-de-sac holiday mixer. Her lawn was manicured to a millimeter of its life, and her living room looked like a page torn out of a Pottery Barn catalog. It was a house built for display, not for living, and certainly not for a narcissistic sociopath and her 5 feral offspring. When the Travis County Sheriff's deputies forced them to unpack that U-Haul in front of God and everyone, it was the social equivalent of a nuclear detonation. But the fallout of actually living together was much, much worse. I didn't have to be there to know what was happening. In American families, the grapevine is a highly efficient intelligence network. Cousins talk to aunts talk to neighbors, and eventually, the gossip trickles down. Plus, Leo still had a few old high school friends who lived in that neighborhood, and teenage boys are exceptionally good at reporting neighborhood drama. Within the first 48 hours, the 5 demons, Braden, Caden, Jaden, Aiden, and Zayden, had completely dismantled my mother's pristine reality. My mother's antique Ming vase, smashed by a stray football thrown in the hallway, the custom white silk sofa she had guarded with her life, stained with grape juice and crushed Doritos within a day, the carefully curated backyard oasis, turned into a muddy battleground littered with broken plastic toys and screaming matches. But the real issue was Chloe. Narcissists are incapable of gratitude. When my parents were forced to take her back in, she didn't view it as a rescue. She viewed it as her rightful inheritance. She took over the master bedroom, forcing my parents into the guest room because, as she loudly proclaimed to my mother in the driveway, "I have 5 kids, Margaret. You expect me to sleep in a twin bed? Grow up." She treated my parents like the help. She demanded my mother cook 3 meals a day, do the laundry, and act as a full-time nanny, all while Chloe slept until noon and spent the afternoon doom-scrolling on her phone, complaining that the Wi-Fi was too slow. The pressure cooker was building. The finances were the match that lit the powder keg. My father, Richard, had drained his retirement, my son's trust fund, and taken out a massive home equity line of credit, HELOC, to keep Chloe afloat over the years. They were essentially broke, living on credit cards and the illusion of wealth. And now, they had 6 extra mouths to feed, utility bills skyrocketing from Chloe leaving the AC on 65 degrees with the doors open and no end in sight. They had always assumed I would be their retirement plan. In their twisted logic, the quiet, hard-working scapegoat would eventually buy a big house, which I did, and they would naturally move in and let me foot the bill for their golden years, which I absolutely did not. With me legally barricaded behind a 5-year restraining order and 50 acres of Texas limestone, the reality of their financial ruin began to set in. The breaking point happened on a sweltering Tuesday evening. According to the police report, which I later pulled from the public records with an icy sense of satisfaction, the incident started over an iPad. Caden, the 9-year-old, had thrown a tantrum because my father had refused to pay for $100 worth of Roblox digital currency on his credit card. In a fit of rage, Caden picked up my father's expensive golf putter and smashed the sliding glass door in the kitchen. My father, already stressed to the breaking point by debt and the impending ruin of his life, finally snapped. He yelled at the boy. He actually raised his voice and told Caden he was out of control. Chloe, hearing the commotion, came charging out of the master bedroom like a rabid dog. You do not discipline a narcissist child, because to a narcissist, the child is just an extension of their own ego. "Don't you ever yell at my son," Chloe shrieked, getting right in my father's face. "Look at what he did, Chloe," my father yelled back, pointing at the shattered glass covering the kitchen floor. "He broke the door. We don't have the money to fix this. We don't have money for anything anymore." "Because you're a failure," Chloe spat back, the venom dripping from her words. The mask had completely slipped. She wasn't the helpless victim anymore. She was the predator who had finished consuming her prey. "You're a weak, pathetic old man. You couldn't even handle Sarah. You let her kick us out. You're useless." My mother tried to intervene, sobbing, begging them to stop because the neighbors were outside. Chloe didn't care. She turned on my mother. "Shut up, Margaret. You're the reason we're stuck in this dump. If you had just handled Sarah better, we'd be living on a ranch right now. You ruined everything." In her rage, Chloe grabbed a heavy ceramic fruit bowl from the kitchen island and hurled it at the wall, missing my father's head by mere inches. It shattered against the drywall, sending shrapnel everywhere. That was when the neighbors, who were already fed up with the screaming, the U-Haul still illegally parked on the street, and the absolute destruction of their quiet cul-de-sac, called the police. When the Austin Police Department arrived, it wasn't the calm, methodical sheriff's deputies from 3 weeks ago. It was local patrol units responding to a violent domestic disturbance. They found my mother hyperventilating on the front lawn, my father bleeding from a small cut on his cheek from the flying ceramic, and Chloe locked in the master bedroom, screaming that she was the victim and her parents were abusing her. The police had to breach the bedroom door. Chloe, in a frantic attempt to play the victim, claimed my father had attacked her, but the 5 kids, terrified and confused, accidentally told the truth to the officers. Mommy threw the bowl. Because Chloe was already on a plea bargain probation for the felony hit and run involving my son, this domestic violence call was a direct violation of her parole conditions. They didn't just give her a warning. They arrested her. They put her in handcuffs, marched her out of the house in her pajamas, and put her in the back of a squad car while the entire neighborhood watched from their driveways. And because she was arrested, Child Protective Services, CPS, was automatically notified. My parents, trembling and broken in their destroyed kitchen, were suddenly left with 5 traumatized children, a shattered glass door, and a daughter sitting in the county jail facing a revocation of her probation. While this suburban nightmare was unfolding, I was sitting on the wraparound porch of my ranch. The Texas night sky was so clear you could see the Milky Way. The only sound was the wind moving through the live oaks and the distant hoot of an owl. Leo came out onto the porch holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. He looked healthier than he had in years. The shadows under his eyes were gone. The defensive, angry posture he had carried while living with them had completely melted away. He was taking online college courses, helping me manage the staffing agency's payroll, and learning how to drive a tractor. He handed me a mug and sat down in the chair next to me. Aunt Cheryl texted me from a burner number, Leo said quietly, looking out at the dark pasture. I didn't look at him. I just kept my eyes on the horizon. Did she? Yeah, he said, taking a sip. She said the cops took Chloe away tonight. CPS is investigating Grandma and Grandpa. They're trying to figure out if the house is safe for the kids to stay in. Cheryl wanted to know if we would take the kids temporarily. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. The audacity of these people was truly bottomless. They honestly believed that after stealing his future and leaving him for dead, they could just dump the collateral damage on our doorstep. I turned to my son. What did you tell her? Leo looked at me, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a boy who had finally grown into a man who understood his own worth. I told her I have a restraining order, and if she ever contacts me again, I'll forward her number to the police for third-party harassment. Then I blocked her. Pride swelled in my chest so fiercely it physically ached. Good boy. Mom, Leo said, his voice dropping to a softer, more reflective tone. Do you ever feel bad for them? Like they're completely destroying themselves? I thought about it. I thought about the $350,000 that should have been sitting in his bank account. I thought about the dashcam footage of my mother pulling his IV line out in the hospital. I thought about the 32 years of being told I was just fine, that I didn't need love or support or a safety net because I wasn't drowning. No, Leo, I said honestly, I don't. When a parasite runs out of food, it starves. That's not a tragedy, that's just biology. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars. We were safe. We were untouchable. But my parents, desperate, cornered, and facing the total collapse of their lives, were about to make one final, catastrophic mistake. They realized that Chloe was going to prison. They realized CPS was breathing down their necks. They realized they were going to lose their house to foreclosure. And in their warped, enabling minds, there was only one solution left. They needed money, a lot of it. And they knew exactly who had it. They couldn't come near me. They couldn't call me. The restraining order was an iron wall. So, they decided to bypass the criminal court entirely. They decided to use the civil court system to launch a Hail Mary attack on my assets. And to do it, they hired the sleaziest, most aggressive shark of a family law attorney in Travis County, a man famous for filing frivolous lawsuits just to force a settlement. 4 days later, a process server pulled up to my heavy iron gate, rang the intercom, and served me with a lawsuit that made my blood run absolutely cold. The document was printed on heavy legal stock, bound with a blue backing folder, and smelled faintly of cheap copier toner. I stood at my kitchen island, the morning sun streaming across the granite, and read the front page 3 times just to make sure I wasn't having a stress-induced stroke. 'Cause no, D1GN-26402911, Richard and Margaret Holloway, plaintiffs versus Sarah Marie Holloway, defendant. Complaint for breach of contract, fraud, and unjust enrichment. I flipped to the second page. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, skipping over the boilerplate text until I hit the core allegation. My parents, through their attorney, a notorious Austin billboard lawyer named Wyatt, the Bulldog Montgomery, were claiming that 5 years ago, they had provided me with a $150,000 seed capital loan to start my healthcare staffing agency. They claimed this loan was made in cash and personal checks, drawn from their own retirement funds. But the real dagger was Attachment A, a promissory note. It was a single page, supposedly drafted in 2021, detailing the terms of the loan. It stated that if the loan was not repaid in full within 5 years, the principal plus an exorbitant amount of compound interest, totaling nearly $420,000, was due immediately. Alternatively, the note stipulated that the plaintiffs were entitled to a 50% equity stake in the business and any real estate purchased with its proceeds. At the bottom of the page was my signature. It wasn't a bad forgery. In fact, it was terrifyingly accurate. It had the slight leftward slant of my civ and the hurried looping H that I used when signing hundreds of hospital charts a week. They forged a contract, I whispered to the empty kitchen. They couldn't get to my son, and they couldn't get onto my land, so they were trying to put a lis pendens, a legal hold, on my ranch. If the court approved it, my assets would be frozen. I wouldn't be able to sell, refinance, or leverage the property until the lawsuit was resolved. It was a classic shakedown tactic. They knew I had the money to fight it, but they were banking on the fact that I would write them a $200,000 go-away check just to avoid the agonizing, years-long nightmare of civil litigation. They needed the money to save their own house from foreclosure and to hire a criminal defense attorney for Chloe, who was currently sitting in the Travis County Jail waiting for her probation revocation hearing. I didn't panic. I took my phone, scanned the entire document using a PDF app, and sent it to my corporate attorney, David Vance. 2 hours later, I was sitting in David's posh downtown Austin office, looking out at the Colorado River. David was a shark in a Tom Ford suit, the kind of lawyer who didn't raise his voice because he didn't have to. "It's a shakedown, Sarah," David said, tossing the blue folder onto his mahogany desk. "Montgomery is a bottom feeder. He files these frivolous claims hoping the defendant will settle out of court to avoid the legal fees. He takes 40% of whatever he extorts from you, and your parents get the rest." "It's a forged signature, David. I never took a dime from them. They didn't even have $150,000 5 years ago. They had already blown it all on Chloe's Malibu rehab and her legal fees from the trust fund they stole from Leo." David leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I believe you. But in civil court, the burden of proof is different. This signature looks real. If we go to trial, it's going to cost you upwards of $80,000 in legal fees, and it will take 2 years. During that time, Montgomery will file a lien against your ranch and your business accounts. He's trying to choke your cash flow." He paused, looking at me carefully. "I can make this go away by Friday. We offer them a nuisance settlement, $75,000. Montgomery will convince them to take it because it's guaranteed cash in his pocket." I stared at David. I thought about my father draining Leo's UTMA account. I thought about my mother ripping the IV out of my son's arm. I thought about 32 years of being told I was fine while they set my world on fire to keep Chloe warm. No, I said. The word dropped like an anvil on the glass desk. David raised an eyebrow. Sarah, strategically. I don't negotiate with terrorists, David. If you give a mouse a cookie, it's going to ask for my 50-acre ranch. They think because they forged my name on a piece of paper, I'll roll over and write a check. I want to destroy this. I want to bury Wyatt Montgomery in sanctions, and I want my parents indicted for perjury and fraud. A slow, dangerous smile spread across David's face. Okay then, if we're going to war, we need to prove this document is a complete fabrication. Where did they get your signature? That was the million-dollar question. I spent the next 3 days turning my home office into a war room. Leo and I went through every single document, tax return, medical form, and lease agreement I had signed in the last 10 years. It was Leo who found it. He was staring at the scanned copy of the promissory note on my massive desktop monitor, zooming in on the signature line at 400% magnification. Mom, he said, pointing at the screen, look at the tail end of the gore in Holloway. See how it cuts off flat? It doesn't fade out like a normal pen stroke. It looks like it was cropped. He pulled up a PDF of an old medical release form from when he was 16, a form my parents had kept in their files because they had briefly tried to claim him as a dependent on their taxes during the alienation phase. Leo overlaid the signature from the medical form directly on top of the signature from the promissory note. It was a 100% biometric match. Every loop, every slant, every microscopic waver of the pen was identical. It wasn't just a good forgery, it was a digital lift. They had scanned the medical form, cropped my signature using Photoshop, and pasted it onto the bottom of their bogus contract. I looked at Leo, the boy they had tried to break, who was now holding the key to their absolute destruction. Call David, I said. Tell him to schedule the deposition. Because of the active 5-year restraining orders, the deposition could not take place in a standard law office. It had to be conducted in a heavily mediated environment at the Travis County Courthouse Annex, with an armed bailiff standing directly inside the door to ensure my parents didn't come within 20 feet of me. The room was sterile, freezing cold, and smelled of floor wax. I sat on one side of a massive oak conference table with David. A court reporter sat at the head, her fingers hovering over her stenograph machine. Then the door opened. My parents walked in, followed by Wyatt Montgomery. It had been months since I had seen them in person, and the physical toll of their choices was shocking. My father looked like he had aged a decade. His shoulders were slumped, his suit hung off him like it belonged to a larger man, and his hands were visibly trembling. My mother, usually coiffed to perfection, looked hollowed out. The stress of having Chloe in jail, 5 feral grandchildren in her ruined house, and CPS breathing down her neck had completely stripped away her country club veneer. They didn't look at me. They couldn't. Wyatt Montgomery, however, strutted in like he owned the building. He wore a flashy pinstripe suit and a gold Rolex that looked heavy enough to act as a weapon. He slapped his briefcase onto the table, completely unbothered by the grim atmosphere. He thought this was going to be an easy payday. He thought I was a scared, overworked nurse who would crack under a little pressure. Let's get this over with, Montgomery said, smirking at David. Unless your client has brought her checkbook, counselor. We're still open to the $150,000 settlement offer. Consider it a family discount. David didn't even blink. We're going on the record, Mr. Montgomery. The court reporter nodded. The deposition began. For the first hour, Montgomery questioned me. He was aggressive, condescending, and loud. He asked about my income, my ranch, and my business. He slid the promissory note across the table, pointing a thick, manicured finger at the signature. Ms. Holloway, you acknowledge that this is your signature on the document, do you not? You took your elderly parents' hard-earned retirement savings to fund your lavish lifestyle, and now that you're rich, you're leaving them out in the cold. Isn't that the truth? That is unequivocally false, I replied, my voice steady, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. Montgomery scoffed. "We'll let a jury decide that." "We won't need a jury," David interrupted, leaning forward, "because it is my turn to question the plaintiffs." David shifted his gaze to my father. Richard swallowed hard, looking down at his clasped hands. "Mr. Holloway," David began, his tone deceptively conversational, "you state in this complaint that you loaned your daughter $150,000 in August of 2021. Is that correct?" "Yes," my father croaked. "And where did this money come from?" Our savings, retirement accounts." "Fascinating," David said. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents as thick as a phone book. "Because we subpoenaed your financial records from Vanguard, Chase Bank, and Wells Fargo for the years 2019 through 2022. According to these sworn bank records, in August of 2021, your total liquid net worth was exactly $4,212. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. Montgomery frowned, his brow furrowing. He hadn't bothered to check their financials. He had just taken their word for it. "In fact," David continued, sliding a spreadsheet across the table, "the records show that every penny of your retirement was liquidated months prior to pay for a luxury rehabilitation facility in Malibu, California, for your other daughter, Chloe. So, Mr. Holloway, unless you were printing counterfeit hundreds in your garage, how exactly did you hand my client $150,000? My father started to sweat. It was cash. Over time, we had cash in a safe." $150,000 in a safe?" David asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You are under oath, sir. Perjury carries a penalty of up to 10 years in a Texas state penitentiary." Montgomery put his hand on my father's arm. "Don't answer that. This is badgering. The promissory note is the binding contract, regardless of the source of the funds. The signature is verified." And that was the moment. The trap was fully set, and David pulled the lever. "I'm glad you brought up the signature, Wyatt," David said smoothly. He reached back into his briefcase. "I have a sworn affidavit here from Dr. Eris Thorne, one of the top forensic document examiners in the state of Texas." Montgomery's smug expression instantly vanished. David slid a high-resolution, blown-up graphic across the table. It showed the promissory note signature next to the medical release form signature. Dr. Thorne conducted a biometric and digital analysis of Exhibit A. Not only is this signature an exact, pixel-for-pixel digital lift from a 2018 medical release form my client signed for her son, but the metadata embedded in the PDF your office filed with the court shows the document was created 3 weeks ago on a MacBook Pro registered to Margaret Holloway. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the rapid breathing of my mother. David wasn't finished. He pulled out one final piece of paper. "Furthermore, the notary stamp at the bottom of your forged document, the one supposedly belonging to a Linda Garvey who witnessed the signing in 2021, David smiled, and it was the most terrifying smile I had ever seen. Linda Garvey died of pancreatic cancer in 2019. We pulled her death certificate. Linda Garvey died of pancreatic cancer in 2019. We pulled her death certificate. If you have never seen a corrupt, overconfident attorney realize that his career is about to go up in flames, it is a truly spectacular thing to witness." Wyatt, the bulldog, Montgomery stopped breathing. The blood drained from his heavily tanned face, leaving him looking like a wax figure left out in the sun. Lawyers like Montgomery operate in the gray areas of the law. They bully, they intimidate, they file frivolous motions to exhaust the opposition, but they do not submit forged documents with dead notary stamps to a district court. That isn't a gray area. That is a fast track to disbarment, federal fraud charges, and a matching orange jumpsuit. Montgomery stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him. He looked at my parents like they were actively radiating nuclear fallout. "Off the record," Montgomery shouted, waving frantically at the court reporter. "We are off the record." "No," David said, his voice calm, cold, and utterly terrifying. We stay on the record. Mr. Montgomery, you submitted Plaintiff's Exhibit A to the court. You entered it into evidence. Are you withdrawing it, or are you doubling down on a felony? Montgomery was sweating through his expensive cologne. He turned on my father, his face turning a violent shade of purple. You told me this was legitimate, Richard. You sat in my office and swore to me that she signed it in your living room. Richard was stuttering, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the oak table. It was just a technicality. She owes us that money. We raised her. We just needed the paperwork to make it official. Margaret began to hyperventilate. The grand, arrogant matriarch of the Holloway clan, the woman who had ripped an IV out of her grandson's arm to protect a sociopath, finally realized that the universe had stopped bending to her will. Montgomery didn't hesitate. He turned to David, his hands raised in surrender. Counsel, I am formally withdrawing as counsel for the plaintiffs, effective immediately. I had absolutely no knowledge of this forgery. I was defrauded by my own clients. I am notifying the judge this afternoon. He snapped his briefcase shut, practically throwing his files into it. He didn't even look at my parents. He stormed out of the room, leaving the heavy door slamming behind him. My parents were left completely alone. No lawyer, no leverage, no escape. David looked at them across the table, methodically packing his own files. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, as of 9 o'clock this morning, I forwarded Dr. Thorne's forensic analysis, the metadata report, and this deposition transcript to the Travis County District Attorney's White Collar Crime Division. Forgery of a financial instrument over $300,000 is a first-degree felony in the state of Texas. Perjury is a third-degree felony. I highly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel. We are adjourned. My mother broke. The facade completely shattered. She reached across the table, tears streaming down her face, her carefully styled hair falling into her eyes. Sarah, please. She sobbed, her voice echoing off the sterile walls of the courthouse annex. Please, honey. We were desperate. We're losing the house. Chloe needs a lawyer. The kids are out of control. We didn't know what else to do. You have so much, and we have nothing. You're our daughter. You have to help us. Please, drop the charges. I looked at her. I waited for the guilt. I waited for that old, familiar childhood conditioning to kick in. The voice that told me I had to set myself on fire to keep them warm. It never came. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel sadness. I felt an overwhelming, profound emptiness where a mother was supposed to be. You didn't have nothing, Mom, I said quietly, holding her frantic gaze. You had a daughter who loved you. You had a grandson who trusted you. You threw us both into a wood chipper to protect Chloe. And when you ran out of money, you tried to steal my ranch. You aren't a mother, you're a parasite. And you finally starved to death. I stood up, adjusted my blazer, and walked out of the room. The armed bailiff stepped aside to let me pass. I didn't look back. The collapse of the Holloway empire was swift, brutal, and entirely public. 3 days later, my parents were arrested at their home on felony forgery and perjury charges. They were handcuffed on their front lawn in front of the exact same neighbors who had watched the U-Haul disaster a month prior. Their house, severely underwater due to the HELOC and multiple missed mortgage payments, was seized by the bank and put up for foreclosure auction. Meanwhile, Chloe was sitting in another wing of the exact same county jail. Her probation revocation hearing went exactly as expected. The judge looked at her long history of theft, the felony hit and run involving my son, and the recent domestic violence charge, and slammed the gavel. She was sentenced to 4 years in a Texas state penitentiary. But the real tragedy, the one that required me to step out of the shadows and make the hardest decision of my life, involved the 5 demons. With my parents in jail waiting to make bail, which they could not afford, and Chloe on her way to state prison, the 5 children, Braden, Caden, Jaden, Aiden, and Zayden, were left completely abandoned. CPS emergency removal teams arrived at the foreclosed house. The kids were terrified. They were dirty, hungry, and completely traumatized by the endless cycle of violence, screaming, and police raids they had endured for their entire short lives. In Texas, when CPS removes children, they desperately look for viable kinship placements before throwing kids into the notoriously overburdened state foster system. I was the only viable kin left. I received the call on a Thursday afternoon. The CPS caseworker sounded exhausted. "Miss Holloway, we have 5 children in emergency custody. Your sister is their mother. Your parents were their primary caregivers, but they are all currently incarcerated. We understand there is a history here, and we know about the restraining orders. But if you don't take them, we will have to split them up into 3 separate foster homes across the state. They will likely never see each other again." I sat on my porch, looking out at the 50 acres of rolling green hills, the massive oak trees, the peaceful, quiet sanctuary I had built for myself and my son. I thought about Chloe. I hated her. I hated everything she stood for. But these kids, they didn't choose to be born to a sociopath. They didn't choose to be raised by enablers who used them as props and punching bags. They were feral because they had to be to survive. They were demons because they were raised in hell. I called Leo out to the porch. He was 20 now, strong, grounded, and incredibly empathetic, despite everything he had been through. I put the phone on speaker and let the caseworker explain the situation. When she finished, there was a long silence. I looked at my son. This was his sanctuary as much as mine. If he said no, I would hang up the phone. "They're my cousins," Leo said softly. "They're monsters right now, Mom. But I remember what it felt like when I thought nobody was coming to save me, when I was bleeding in that car. When Grandma tried to silence me in the hospital." He looked out at the sprawling pasture. "We have the space. We have the money. We can't let them go into the system." I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and said the words that would change my life forever. "Bring them to the Blanco County Ranch, but I have conditions. I want emergency custody, and I will immediately file for full, permanent legal guardianship. I will not be a temporary babysitter for my sister to use as a pawn when she gets out of prison. If they come to my land, they are mine. My parents and my sister lose all parental and visitation rights, period." The caseworker, desperate to keep the siblings together, agreed. The legal paperwork was expedited by a family court judge who was already intimately familiar with the Holloway family's criminal record. 2 days later, a white county passenger van pulled up to my heavy iron gate. The intercom buzzed. I pressed the button, and the gate swung open. 5 terrified, exhausted, traumatized children walked onto my property. They were clutching black trash bags filled with the few clothes CPS had managed to grab from the ruined suburban house. They looked at the massive limestone farmhouse, the horses grazing in the pasture, the sheer, quiet space of it all, with wide, disbelieving eyes. They expected me to scream at them. They expected chaos. They expected the dysfunction they had breathed like air since birth. Zayden, the youngest at 4 years old, was trembling so hard he could barely walk. I knelt down in the gravel driveway so I was at eye level with him. I didn't crowd them. I didn't force a hug. "Welcome home," I said quietly, looking at all 5 of them. "Nobody is going to yell at you here. Nobody is going to hit you, and nobody is ever going to make you leave. I won't lie to you and say the transition was like a movie montage set to an uplifting pop song. It wasn't. Bringing 5 feral, deeply traumatized children into a quiet sanctuary was like dropping a grenade into a still pond. The first 6 months were absolute, unadulterated hell. Trauma in children doesn't look like quiet sadness. It looks like rage. It looks like Caden, the 9-year-old, hoarding moldy bread under his mattress because he was conditioned to believe food might run out at any second. It looks like 12-year-old Jaden punching a hole in the drywall because I asked him to put his shoes in the closet. It looks like 4-year-old Zayden hiding under the porch for 3 hours, terrified that I was going to call the police on him for spilling a glass of milk. They tested the boundaries with the desperation of prisoners rattling the bars of a cage. They were waiting for me to snap. They were waiting for the screaming, the physical abuse, the inevitable moment where I would throw my hands up, call CPS, and send them away, just like everyone else in their lives had done. But I had something my parents and my sister never had: absolute ironclad consistency. And I had the financial resources to build a fortress of support around them. I hired a team of the best pediatric trauma therapists in Austin. We did cognitive behavioral therapy. We did equine therapy with the horses in the lower pasture. Leo, who understood the specific toxic brand of Holloway manipulation better than anyone on earth, became the ultimate older brother. He taught the older boys how to work on the tractor, how to fish in the creek, and how to channel their anger into chopping firewood instead of destroying the house. The turning point happened about 8 months in. Caden had a meltdown over a math worksheet. In a blind panic, he picked up a heavy wooden chair and hurled it at the living room window. The glass shattered, raining down onto the hardwood floor. The house went dead silent. The other 4 kids froze in sheer terror. In my parents' house, breaking a window meant a screaming match, police, or worse. Caden dropped to his knees, covering his head with his arms, waiting for the blow. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my heart rate. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a heavy-duty broom and a dustpan, and walked back into the living room. I knelt down next to him, handed him the broom, and said in a calm, steady voice, "In this house, we clean up our own messes. Sweep up the glass, Caden, then we'll go measure the frame so we can drive to Home Depot and buy a new pane." He peeked out from under his arms, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. You're not calling the police? You're not sending me back?" "I am never sending you back," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You could break every window in this house, and I would just buy a lot of glass. You are my son now. Now sweep." He burst into tears. Real, ugly, cleansing tears. He hugged my waist so tight it bruised my ribs. That was the day the fever broke. That was the day the 5 demons died, and 5 exhausted, frightened little kids were finally allowed to just be kids. While my home was slowly healing, the remnants of the Holloway Empire were being systematically dismantled by the state of Texas. My parents, terrified of spending the rest of their lives in a state penitentiary, took a brutal plea deal for the felony forgery and perjury charges. They avoided prison time, but they were sentenced to 10 years of felony probation, 500 hours of community service, and massive financial restitution to the court. Because they were convicted felons, their credit was completely destroyed. They lost the suburban house to the bank. Their country club friends dropped them so fast it would give you whiplash. The people my mother had spent her entire life trying to impress now crossed the street at the grocery store to avoid making eye contact with her. Today, Richard and Margaret Holloway live in a dingy, 1-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex in North Austin. My father works as a part-time greeter at a big-box hardware store. My mother, who used to brag about her designer handbags, now takes in cheap clothing alterations to make rent. The 5-year restraining order is still in full effect. I have a private security camera system that scans license plates at my gate, and the local sheriff's department knows my address by heart, but they have never tried to come. Narcissists thrive on power, and they have absolutely none left. They are irrelevant, broke, and entirely alone. As for Chloe, she is serving out her 4-year sentence at the Lane Murray Unit, a maximum security women's prison in Gatesville. When she first arrived, she tried to call me collect. She tried to send letters playing the victim, begging me to keep the kids warm for her, until she got out. I didn't read them. I handed them directly to my attorney, David, who used them as evidence in family court. Because of her felony incarceration, her history of abuse, and my parents' criminal convictions, the state of Texas filed for involuntary termination of all parental rights. Chloe fought it, of course, entirely out of ego, but you can't fight a mountain of evidence from inside a prison cell. Last November, a family court judge slammed his gavel and legally severed Chloe from the 5 children forever. 10 minutes later, in that same courtroom, I raised my right hand and officially, legally adopted them. Braden, Caden, Jaden, Aiden, and Zayden are no longer the collateral damage of a sociopath. They are Holloway's. They are mine. Fast forward to today. It is Thanksgiving morning on the Blanco County Ranch. There is no screaming. There are no police cars in the driveway. There is no U-Haul idling on the curb. I am sitting on the wraparound porch with a cup of black coffee. The Texas air is crisp and smells like cedar smoke. Down in the pasture, Leo is teaching Zayden, now an energetic, hilarious 7-year-old, how to saddle one of the quarter horses. The older boys are in the kitchen, arguing good-naturedly over who gets to carve the turkey, while the smell of roasting garlic and sage drifts out through the screen door. They get straight B's in school. They do their chores without being asked, most of the time. They laugh loudly, they sleep through the night, and they know, with absolute certainty, that they are safe. I thought back to the night my parents drained my son's trust fund. I thought about the text message my mother sent me on closing day. Family takes care of family. She was right, in a twisted sort of way. Family does take care of family. But blood is just biology. Blood doesn't make you a mother, a father, or a sister. Blood doesn't give you a free pass to destroy someone's soul, steal their future, and demand a thank you note in return. True family is the people who hold the line. It's the people who refuse to let you drown. It's a 20-year-old boy helping his traumatized little cousins learn how to trust the world again. It's the quiet, meticulous boundaries you build to protect the peace you earned with your own bare hands. If you are listening to this, and you are the scapegoat in your family, if you are the one who is always fine, the one expected to quietly absorb the abuse so the golden child can shine, hear me right now. Stop waiting for the courtroom in their heads to find you worthy. Stop waiting for the apology that is never coming. Take your money, take your peace, and walk away. Build your own fortress. Let the parasites starve. Because on the other side of that guilt, there is a 50-acre ranch, a quiet morning, and a life that is entirely, beautifully yours. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to cut off toxic family to save yourself, drop a comment below and share how you found your peace. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories about surviving, escaping, and thriving. I'll see you in the next one.